Well, I'm Lee Hamberg. I live in Southwick. I've lived here just about my entire life, and I grew up in the jog. And I'm a member of the Southwick Historical Society, which runs the Southwick History Museum, also located in the jog. It was built in the 1750s by Joseph Moore. And he's an interesting lad that got caught up in the jog controversy also. From what I've heard over the decades, the term jog is almost exclusively used in Massachusetts because it physically describes the part of Massachusetts that jogs down into Connecticut. However, if you go into Connecticut, people typically use the term notch because they think of Southwick as taking a notch out of Connecticut. So I think that's how the two terms came to be. It's simply a description of what it does on a map. Massachusetts got a royal charter, I believe it was in 1640, and it described the southern boundary as going due west from a point 3 miles south of the southernmost source of the Charles River. Now, at that point in time, if you went due west with no end in sight, you would have gone all the way to the Pacific Ocean. It wasn't until 1642, though, that they had surveyors hired to actually survey at least a part of that southern boundary to the Connecticut River. And by the time they got to the Connecticut River, they were 7 miles off. They supposedly didn't do a ground, in the field survey beginning at that point 3 miles south of the Charles River and transversing west by land. Supposedly they got into a ship, went up the Connecticut River, and fixed their surveying instruments in such a way that they thought that they were at the same latitude, but they were roughly 7 miles too far south. Connecticut contested, but they didn't have a royal charter at the time, so they didn't have too much legal standing with the British royalty. So really it was an elongated wedge and not really a jog initially. But over time, it turned out that just a few towns really created this wedge or jog as we know it. Towns of Enfield, Connecticut, Somers, Connecticut, Suffield, and part of what was in Westfield or Simsbury, Connecticut. And those areas there were all considered part of Massachusetts. In fact, Suffield sent its representatives all the way until roughly 1746 or 7 to Massachusetts, to the General Court. Well, one story I have is a story of a schoolhouse, and it used to be located in Granby, Connecticut, right at or just south of the corner boundary marker of the Southwick jog, the southwest corner. And the privy or outhouse was actually over the state line in Massachusetts. So the story goes that the kids would raise their hand, "Teacher, teacher, I need to go to Massachusetts." I tried to verify it, but I couldn't with my grandfather, even though he attended that school for probably a couple of years. He neither accepted nor rejected the story, which probably said, "Yeah, you're right." We had a speaker at the Historical Society a few years back give the same spiel that the jog belongs to Connecticut and we should take it back. But I don't think there's anything going to come about of that movement. If there's any property taxes being assessed on the dock, that goes to the town of Southwick. That's right, because the entire lake, all of Congamon Lakes, belongs to Massachusetts, with the exception of one little cove that's known as the Connecticut Cove. But I don't even believe there's any houses on that. So if they have a dock in the lake, it's technically in Massachusetts territory. Well, the last boundary decision made by the states of Connecticut and Massachusetts were made in 1803 and took effect, I think, January 1 of 1804. So since 1804, the boundary has been almost exactly as you see it now, and no changes that I'm aware of. I don't think there's any real difference whether you go on one side of the boundary or the other as far as the people. They're all good people, and I don't think there's any animosity one way or another, although there have been a few occasions where there have been issues, and one that I can think of is a person had a trailer that caught fire, and he called the Granby Fire Department to put out the fire in Connecticut, Granby, Connecticut. And they came, and they unrolled their hoses, and then they looked and saw exactly that the trailer was parked in Massachusetts. They rolled up their hoses and said, "You'll have to call Southwick," and they drove away. And of course, the trailer was total loss before it was put out.
Do you know about when that happened?
Oh, I want to say the 80s or 90s.
Oh, wow. So relatively recently.
Yeah, I mean, it's not that long ago that people don't remember it, or you could even talk to the owner still. There was a story of right after Prohibition, the state line bar opening up, and they built an addition on the Massachusetts side because of blue laws. One side you could drink, and the other side you could dance on Sundays, I think. So you could both dance and drink in the same establishment.
So one part of the establishment was in Connecticut and the other was in Massachusetts?
Correct.
Which side was which?
Let's see. I think the dancing was on Massachusetts, but don't quote me on that. You could probably speak to the State Line Bar and Grill today and still get someone that has that information. I think one example that I can share is the Joseph Moore, or the Moore House, owned by the Historical Society, the Southwick Historical Society, is a curious example in that the house has been in 2 colonies and 2 states, Connecticut and Massachusetts, 3 counties, Hartford County, Hampshire County, Hamden County, and in 4 towns, Simsbury, Granby, Southwick, and Westfield, but it's never been moved. And they are social political boundaries. There's no doubt about it. There's no real geography that explains why the boundary is where it is. There isn't any reason for that. But, boundaries do have, direct impact on people as far as taxes or where people serve in the military, particularly in the colonial period. We had one man who owned the house, Joseph Moore, and instead of fighting for the colony of Massachusetts because of the boundary change. He was involved with the Connecticut, with the Simsbury, Connecticut militia, the 18th Regiment. And he had to respond to the call for defending New York City. And he ended up being captured and died as a prisoner of war because of that reality. Now, if his home had fallen in Southwick at the time, he probably would have been asked to go to Lexington and Concord and gotten there a week late and marched back home, and that would have been it. It was very unfortunate. 56 years old at the time, too. So imagine if you had to march 175 miles to New York City with backpack and sleeping roll and all that, and musket and black powder.